Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp, and I'm the Chief Digital Officer of DATAVERSITY. We would like to thank you for joining the current installment of the monthly DATAVERSITY webinar series, Real World Data Governance with Bob Seiner. Today, Bob will discuss advanced techniques for metadata-driven data governance. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. If you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And just to note, Zoom defaults the chat to send to just the panelists. We will eventually change that to network with everyone. For questions, we'll be collecting them by the Q&A section. And to find the chat and the Q&A panels, you can find those icons in the bottom middle of your screen or at the top toolbar for those features. And as always, we will send a follow-up email within 2 business days containing links to the slides, the recording of the session, and additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce to you the speaker for our series, Bob Seiner. Bob is the president and principal of KIK Consulting and Educational Services and the publisher emeritus of the data administration newsletter, tdan.com. Bob specializes in non-invasive data governance, data stewardship, and metadata management solutions. And with that, let me give the floor to Bob to get his presentation started. Bob, hello and welcome.
Hi, Shannon. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay, first of all? And can you see my screen okay?
All looks good.
Hey, we are good to go. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, everybody, for, as I always say, taking time out of your busy schedule to sit through the monthly webinar series, the Real World Data Governance webinar series. This is the next to last webinar in the series. So in the month of December, they always fall on the third Thursday of the month. That'll be the last in the series. And what's really interesting is when Shannon and I set out and put the different subjects together for the year, they always seem to fall at the right time. We schedule them a year in advance. And this topic really brings me kind of full circle in my career. If you were with us way back in 2012 when we started this webinar series, I talked a lot about metadata. I still talk a lot about metadata. Metadata is very important for data governance. It was just perfect that we had scheduled this one for November of this year to talk about some of those advanced techniques for kind of driving data governance success using metadata within the organization. So happy to have you here. And as I said, this is episode 166 of 167, and I hope you will join us in December for the final episode of the series. Just before I get started here, I want to share with you, as I always do, if you've never been to the webinar series before, well, welcome. If this is your first time, but just a little bit about me before we get started. Like I said, we've been doing this webinar series for a long time, and the season finale, the series finale, will be the topic will be building a data governance culture from your top leadership all the way down to grassroots adoption within your organization. And again, I think that's a perfect subject to kind of wrap up the webinar series. I talk a lot about non-invasive data governance. I've written several books on the subject, as you can see here. There are online courses and learning plans that are available through DataVersity about non-invasive data governance, about non-invasive metadata governance, and also about business glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs, which we'll touch on a little bit during the webinar today. The name of my consulting business is KIK Consulting and Educational Services. KIK stands for Knowledge is King. And in my spare time, I am also on the faculty at Carnegie Mellon University here in my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in their Chief Data and AI Officer program. There is one more thing I want to announce on this slide here. And I know I've been putting ticklers out this in the last several webinars, but we're getting closer and closer to the publishing date. The new book is going to be coming out sometime around the end of the year called The Data Catalyst Cubed. And it's all about accelerating data governance with change management and data fluency. So I hope you'll show some interest in that when that book becomes available. So what are we going to talk about today? There's a lot of different subjects and we've got an hour, so I'm going to take a good part of it. We'll leave some time at the end for questions if you have questions. Like I said, I've been working in the field of metadata management before I even got into data management, data governance, data modeling, data quality, and those types of things. In fact, in the corporate world, when I was a metadata repository administrator, and I talked about metadata so much when I was back in the corporate world that one of my colleagues would refer to me as Mr. Metadata, and he thought that was making fun of me. To me, that was a proud label to carry. I want to share with you some of the techniques, even from back in those days when I was a corporate metadata repository administrator, that things that I hope will resonate with you and that will ring true and help you to drive success with your governance program using metadata. Then we'll talk about leveraging metadata, specifically leveraging the metadata that we do have collected and that we are governing to enhance our governance program. When people are asked, what is the first order of business for their governance programs? At least in a course that I taught last week, we opened a poll and people said, data governance is really there to help to improve data quality. So I'm going to focus a little bit on how do we use metadata to improve data quality and improve accessibility to data through the metadata. We'll talk about ensuring compliance because everybody thinks that governance itself is all about compliance. We'll talk about ensuring that your compliance is successful. And then at the end, as I like to do, I'll share some examples of some organizations that I've worked with, and some of them are kind of generic, just examples of organizations that have implemented successful metadata strategies and have implemented metadata governance as a part of those strategies. So as I do at the beginning of my sessions, I always start with a couple of definitions, and I've got 2 pages. Just I'm going to go through them quickly with you. If you've been attending this webinar series for some time, my definitions keep getting shorter and shorter. The definition of data governance that I use is that it is the execution and enforcement of authority over the management of data and data-related assets. Okay, I've stripped off the end of it because I really think that governance itself, as a definition, is the execution and enforcement of authority. It doesn't say that it has to be command and control, top down, non-invasive. It just means that at the end of the day, we need to execute and enforce authority over that which we are governing. And then stewardship, I also had a longer definition, the formalization of accountability for the management of data and data-related assets. I've kind of stripped that off as well to just define stewardship. If you look up the word steward in the dictionary, the dictionary definition is somebody who takes care of something for somebody else. And I say, so there's a level of accountability there. And if we're going to talk about stewardship as part of our governing efforts, we need to formalize accountability for the management, for the governance of whatever it is that we're governing. So again, the execution and enforcement of authority, the formalization of accountability. If we kind of extend those into data, it's the execution and enforcement of authority over data. People are talking about AI and AI governance. I mean, it's in every conversation. So if we talk about AI governance and you want a quick definition for what AI governance is, it's going to be the execution and enforcement of authority over AI. Now, you need to define what you mean by authority within your organization, but doing the right things, making certain that people trust the data, have confidence in the data are some of those things. And the last definition for this page that I want to share with you is my definition of metadata. So that the term metadata is always described as being data about data, but I take it a little bit further, and my definition is still longer. It has 4 different parts to it. So the first thing about metadata is it is data. It is something that we need to store somewhere. And I say it's stored in IT tools. Those IT tools could be the back of a napkin. If you're drawing a model on a napkin, it's not the best place to store your metadata, but it needs to be stored somewhere. And then it improves both the business and the technical understanding and because metadata has always been seen, or at least a long time ago, when I got my start, it was seen to be there to help the technical use of data. And now it's really the metadata pertains to things that aren't just the data. It pertains to the stewards, it pertains to the policies, it pertains to the models and those types of things. So data and data related assets. Again, it's data that's stored somewhere that improves both business and technical understanding of data and the data related assets. It's not your grandfather's metadata where it was always, the rows and columns of a table. Metadata now means a lot more than that. Okay, another just quick two definitions. The first one is advanced techniques. So yes, I've been working in the field of metadata management for many years. I won't say that these techniques are the know-all and be-all, but I would say that they have demonstrated a lot of success for me. And so basically, these are practices that I've refined over the years. I've made them repeatable within the organizations that I've worked for and the organizations I've worked with. And they need to be thoughtfully engineered, and it really needs to take you from some level of theory to some level of business ready execution for your metadata management and for your data governance. So I'm going to share with you some advanced techniques. That'll be the first thing that I talk about, and then we'll relate it to some of those other things that I said we were going to talk about today. And then the last definition is metadata driven data governance. And take a second to read what I'm saying here. It's the most important word in that definition is the intentional use of descriptive information. So it's the orderly, yes, we want to have some method to the way that we're doing it, but we need to be very intentional about the way that we manage our metadata. There's something that I presented at a DATAVERSITY conference many years ago. I had a whiteboard in front of the room and I wrote the words, "The metadata will not govern itself." So if we want to take advantage of the data that we have by providing description and trust to that data, and we know that metadata is going to be our path to get there, the metadata will not govern itself. We need to be very intentional about how we go about governing our metadata. I'm not going to go into a lot of details as to what that is. Certainly, you can connect to me on LinkedIn or reach out to me, and we can certainly talk a little bit more about that. The last thing I want to say here for the definitions, that is, if your data governance program as it stands now isn't being driven by the metadata that you have, the information that you have about your data, there's a good chance that it's going to become personality driven, opinion driven, meeting driven. It's going to be harder to sustain those over a period of time. It's going to be harder to repeat those things over a period of time. And they're certainly not going to be non-invasive. They're going to be more invasive to the culture of your organization. So I say that if your governance program isn't metadata driven, it's not necessarily going to provide all the fruit of your labor that you're expecting to have it provide. All right, before we jump into the advanced techniques, just a couple quick sets of questions to get started. The first ones, and so the answers, I provide answers to these questions here in a minute, but the answers, I have question marks next to them. In fact, I'll show them to you right now. That do you need to manage and govern your metadata in order to be, as I've described, what metadata driven is? And do you need to govern your data to be metadata driven? Do you need to have a catalog or a metadata repository? And I answer those questions no, but it sure will help. I mean, certainly you want to have stewards of the metadata. There are people defining, producing, using your metadata. You want to have stewards of your data. You want to collect your metadata in an IT tool somewhere. So I say no, because a lot of organizations, when they're just asked that question, say, no, we don't do these things yet. And we need to start doing these things better. And then the second set of questions is, do you manage your metadata? Do you need to govern your data? Do you have a data catalog? And so I think this is the direction that many organizations are going, is they want to do a better job managing their metadata. They want to do a better job governing their data. And they understand that a data catalog is going to be an important instrument for their success, to somewhere to put their metadata, somewhere to give people access to the metadata. So, okay, I've spent 15 minutes just kind of giving you the setup for the session. I'm going to go through some of these slides here a little bit quicker. But the first thing that I want to talk about, it's the name of the webinar today, is about those advanced techniques for metadata management. And so these are things, again, that I mentioned I had experienced. I'll provide a little bit of insight into how these things were beneficial to me, even back in the early days of being a metadata repository administrator, but automating how you're getting metadata into the tool and not depending on people to put that metadata into the tool is really important. Focusing on lineage and using the lineage and knowing where the data comes from, and also knowing that if you're going to make a change somewhere, what the impact is going to be, is an advanced technique. Using the metadata that you have wherever it is that you're storing your metadata to kind of drive your rules, your policies, your quality controls. And again, is another advanced technique. Tagging, one of the things I learned very early on as a metadata person was that if we can tag and group our metadata together, it's going to make it easier for people to find. It's going to make the data easier for people to find. And then using some of the metadata that we have to understand what metadata is being used and how it's being used. So these are the 5, I'll call them resonating themes that I want to discuss throughout the webinar today. And I'm going to highlight for you specifically what those things are. It's the automation. Whenever we depend on human intervention to do things, it's going to be um, less successful, or should I say less of the time, than if we can automate how we're harvesting. The lineage is important. Using metadata to drive things in your organization, tagging, and focusing on behavioral data. You'll see those are things that resonate throughout the rest of the webinar today. So the first advanced technique that I want to talk about is automating the metadata harvesting. And I can tell you, back in the corporate world, when I implemented my first mainframe metadata repository, um, we knew that people that were going to be looking at the metadata were going to be challenging us to make certain that that the information that we were providing was up to date. And so what's really funny is there were people that had made changes to database tables the day before we presented it to them. And they said, oh, we changed this yesterday. We want to see if the metadata accurately reflects that. The truth is, we had already implemented things that on a nightly basis scanned the tools to take the metadata and ingest it into the repository. When they saw that the table definition was up to date, they asked us how the heck we did that. And we said, we don't need people to kick anything off. We are going to automate the way that we are going to harvest and bring metadata into the system. So that moment that you rely on humans to do something, you can almost guarantee that at some point it's going to be stale or incomplete, or at some point it's just going to fall by the wayside. So automation of metadata harvesting is that first advanced technique. And if there's something that you take away from this session, I'm hoping that that's a really important part of it. Everybody talks about data lineage and using data lineage for impact analysis. So what we need to do is again, another technique is if you're struggling to determine what metadata that you want to incorporate into your data catalog tool, people want to know where the data came from. They want to know what's going to break if something changes. So we need to focus on capturing that lineage metadata, not only at a technical level, which basically tells you, what moved to where and what, but it tells you the business reasoning, why this data was selected, why this data is transformed. We need to collect all of that. So capturing lineage, not only at a technical level, but at a business level, is critical to use of your tool, of your metadata driven tool that's going to help to drive your data governance program. I mentioned before, again, one of those 5 main themes is, what are we going to do with all this metadata that we're collecting into our tool? It's not just going to be table definitions. It's not just going to be business glossaries and dictionaries. Metadata, the definition of metadata has gone way beyond that. So once we know that we have policies, we have classifications, we have sensitivities, we have things embedded into our metadata, another one of those advanced techniques is to utilize that information kind of proactively. So you can trigger these actions automatically, and there's no fire drills, there's no emails. It's just built directly into the workflow of the data. And to give you some examples of that, if people have access, the classification levels, all of those types of things really help. You have it in your metadata. Why don't we use it as part of our active move from passive metadata to more active metadata and just build it into the workflow? That's what non-invasive is all about. If we can just build things into what we do and embed things into the culture, they're going to be a lot better accepted in organizations. That whole concept of tagging, it seems like a very simple subject, but I mean, the idea of it's one of those advanced techniques for metadata management is connecting the metadata to things that people are used to searching on. So like common business terms or tagging assets by their domain or subject area or their sensitivity or their part of the business, just to make the metadata more searchable. It makes the metadata more active within the organization when people can start with these things that you've tagged, these tags that you've provided to your metadata, the groupings of the metadata to make sense. I can remember, again, back to the corporate days, that we had people coming to us suggesting how to tag the metadata so it could be reported on together, instead of just getting everything that was in the data catalog. So again, semantic tagging is one of those advanced techniques. And then the last of the five things that I talked about, as being kind of the themes that will resonate throughout, is using some of the metadata that we're collecting beyond what traditionally we've been used to using metadata for, even lineage or definitions or those types of things. There's metadata being collected about who uses the data, how often they use it, where the certified data is being used within the organization, what data drives reports. These are all important aspects of metadata that kind of go beyond that traditional view of metadata. These are behavioral, these are analytics metadata, things that are, again, could be a way to help you to pinpoint those things that are most valuable within your metadata repository or your data catalog tool. All right, so I walked through those five concepts relatively quickly with you as being the advanced techniques, for metadata-driven data governance. If you notice that the other sections that I'm going to talk about in the webinar today, they all kind of come back to those five themes. And so when we're talking about leveraging metadata to enhance your data governance program, again, going back to the idea of turning that metadata into automation, into automated controls. We'll talk about that here in a second. People talk about the single source, excuse me, the single source of truth. Well, consider your data catalog or your metadata store as being your single source of truth for definitions, for usage, for all these things that you're putting great effort into collecting and maintaining within your metadata tool. Using the lineage, again, back to another one of those themes, using the lineage to eliminate any mystery or to reduce risk around your data. Using the metadata to support the stewards and the domain owners. I don't like using the term owner. I think I changed it a little bit later in the deck to the domain subject matter experts. I kind of shy away from the term owner, because it implies exactly the opposite of what being a steward means. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of leveraging metadata is going to be to measure value and demand through, again, those behavioral statistics that we can get from metadata about how data is being used throughout the organization. So the first one here was the turn metadata into automated controls. Again, when you have things like the sensitivity, the classification, the business rules, it becomes best practice when you can kind of build those into decisions that are being made, to reports that are being provided to you as to the quality of the data. Build these things into what you've got, and that way you're not just using metadata as like your library to start to define, to provide definition to the data. It's now become an active part of the controls associated with governing data within your organization. And again, if you can activate that, you're removing that burden from people. And again, if you're relying on people to do things, there's a possibility that that might go stale or it might get dropped completely. So again, wherever you can automate the controls, that seems to make a lot of sense. Everybody talks about the single point of truth, the master data. Make your data catalog or your metadata repository tool that source of truth for not just definitions and not just lineage, but give give people a place for them to go to understand what data they're using, how they're using it. Give them an opportunity to provide additional information back to your repository to let people know what value they're getting from the metadata. Again, make the catalog or your metadata repository that single source of truth for all of the metadata within your organization. Another way to leverage metadata to enhance governance is to use the lineage. People always want to know where this number came from, or if numbers are different on different reports, why are the numbers different? Well, the fact is that if you can provide detailed lineage information to those people, you immediately build trust from them. It's no longer, hey, we'll go and we'll find where that data came from. If you can provide it, you're going to build trust with the people that are using the data. You're going to build trust with the people that are using the metadata as well. So another way to leverage metadata to make your data governance program provide more value to your organization is to use the lineage metadata to eliminate that mystery and to reduce risk in your organization. And use the metadata to support your stewards. And here's where it said domain owners, and I just switched it to subject matter experts. But use the metadata, leverage the metadata to support the people that are going to be most active in your data governance program. The operational stewards, the tactical stewards, the domain stewards, those being the subject matter experts that people rely on. So, the metadata can highlight who has done what with the data, who produces it, who uses it, who certifies it, and all of those types of things. When I put this together, I said governance becomes more non-invasive. I think what I was meant to say was governance becomes less invasive when the stewards aren't spending their time digging through the data and they have that level of trust with the data through the metadata. So that's really metadata that is driving your data governance program. And then the last one of those five, I'm sorry, this is the last one of those five, is to use the metadata that you're collecting, even the usage statistics that you can get out of some of the tools that you have in your environment. What data are people querying? When are they querying it? How much are they querying it? How are they using it? All those types of things will really help you to tell a story for, first of all, why you need metadata management to begin with, and those aspects of the metadata that people are getting the most value from. So again, another way to leverage metadata is to measure that value not only through the traditional metadata that we talk about, but through the analytics of usage metadata, usage metadata for the metadata. All right, another subject I want to go through quickly with you here is the one that everybody talks about with data governance, is they want to use data governance. When they get past compliance, they want to talk about improving quality and improving accessibility to data. And again, those same five themes resonate: the automation, the lineage, the tagging, the usage analytics. All of those types of things are what I would consider to be kind of those advanced techniques for becoming metadata driven in the way that you do data governance. So the first one here is automating the quality rules, putting visibility into your lineage, tagging the data, analyzing the usage data and the data for prioritizing your quality improvements, and then certifying the data based on the metadata that you have within your tool. So the first one is automating the quality rules. Again, if you can use the system to read off of the metadata that you have in your tools to validate and to flag when there are issues with data in real time, rather than just reporting them as kind of a after the fact deal, this is going to help to improve the quality of your data. Because again, you're not counting on a person to go and highlight these things. The tool knows what the rules are because you have them in your metadata storage, using those rules to provide some of these automated quality checks of data as it's feeding through from one system to another, or even feeding from your systems into your AI models. Another way to improve data quality accessibility is to improve the visibility into the data lineage and into the transformations. I know from my experience that people want to know where the data came from, how is it different from its origin, how it changed, where it's going. The more people understand and they can see the lineage, they're going to understand the business logic behind the numbers. They're going to better trust the data. And I know that I keep hearing people talk about it. If we're going to equate data governance with one word, it's trust. We need to get people to trust the data. And if we can do it by increasing visibility into data lineage and into how the data has transformed to make it where the way it is, where they're viewing it, it's going to build some of that trust with people who are using the data. And again, I know I'm kind of repeating some things here, but that whole idea of tagging the data, making the data easier for people to find, using things that make sense, domain names, things, business units, whatever it is within your organization, which is an appropriate way for you to tag your metadata. Just again, make it easily accessible, easily searchable for people throughout your organization. And then using the analytics to prioritize quality improvement. I keep saying there's a lot of metadata beyond just the traditional metadata that a lot of people store. The better job we can do of managing that metadata, the better job we'll do of improving the way people are using data and understanding how people are using data and what data they're using. That's really important. Again, another way to improve quality and accessibility is to use these analytics to kind of hone in and focus on those areas where you can make the biggest improvements. And the last thing to share here is that people are these days are using the metadata to certify the data, meaning that if you don't have a definition, if we have not identified an owner, again, not really the steward or the subject matter expert of the data, if there's no lineage, if we can't tell where the data has come from, we don't have a quality score, we don't have any metrics on how this data is being used, if it is even being used within the organization, people are starting to include metadata completeness as a way to be able to certify data assets in the organization. So if you want to provide that green light to data that's, as it says here, trustworthy, accessible, safe to use, all of those things, we can use metadata to say, hey, this data, we don't know it. We don't have documented record of this data enough to say that we certify its use across the organization. Okay, the last subject I want to talk about before we jump into a couple quick case studies is the one thing that everybody thinks when they first think about data governance. It's about ensuring compliance. So again, to keep with the same themes that I've talked about from the beginning of the session, baking the rules into the workflow, certifying the assets, making non-compliance visible. We'll talk about all these things, leveraging the usage statistics, automating your ability to be able to audit your data is really important. So the first one is baking the rules into the workflow. If we can find a way to use the metadata that we have stored in our systems to enforce standards automatically, it's going to go a great distance towards not only improving the quality of the data, as I mentioned before, but also making certain that we're complying, that we're letting the appropriate people see the data, that they have the right understanding of the data before they see the data. So just kind of, again, baking the rules into the workflow and not putting them in a policy binder that you have sitting on your counter or on your shelf. Again, activate your metadata by baking it into the workflows. Certifying data assets through metadata evidence. I've been working with the federal government for a while now, and they keep talking about evidence. Everything needs to be evidence-based. Well, you can certify your data assets through providing your metadata as your evidence. And you can only, if this is something you choose to do, you can decide to label your data as certified only when the metadata that is being collected has been defined and is available for people to be able to use. So certify your data assets, as I mentioned earlier, through the metadata evidence, through the detailed documentation of who owns the data or who stewards the data, where the data came from, the quality of the data, the confidentiality level of the data, and such. And another way to ensure that compliance, that ensuring that compliance is metadata driven, is don't make non-compliance punitive. Make it more visible. And if you are collecting metadata, it's very easy to be able to determine where there are gaps in the metadata, where metadata is missing. We don't need to point our fingers at people. We just need to be able to show, here's where we have good definitions. Here's where some of those definitions are missing. Let's work together to make certain that we are providing the same level of trust and confidence around the data, no matter where it comes from. So let's make non-compliance to becoming metadata driven. Let's make it more visible, not necessarily something that's punitive. And here I decided to draw a red circle around this guy. We don't want to punish people for not collecting and recording their metadata. What we want to do is help them to understand where there are gaps and where those gaps will be beneficial to the organization. Another way to ensure compliance is to leverage those usage statistics to reinforce good behavior. You can use the data that you have about usage to promote and reward and replicate behaviors. I think that makes sense. We want to make certain that we know that the people that are following the rules, that are using the metadata that we have, that they're being recognized for doing good work. We want to promote that. We want to reward them. We want to make certain that if we see how they are behaving, that we can replicate those behaviors in different parts of the organization. And automating auditability. I mean, again, that becomes important. The auditors, people who come in, I don't know how often you get audited, but they love it when you have metadata available to them. So if you're going to ensure compliance somehow, some way through your metadata tools, being able to make that metadata available to auditors. I was one time yelled at a client for saying that I considered the auditors to be your friends. The auditors can point out to you where there are gaps in things like knowledge about the data, around your classification, and those types of things too. So automate this auditability wherever you can. And you can see here's, again, a resounding theme throughout this webinar is automate, automate, automate. If we can move people out of the cycle and we can get quality metadata into our tools and provide that to people, we are going to improve, we are going to advance our data governance program through the use of the metadata. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes left before we turn it over for Q&A. I just have a couple, or actually 4 different case studies I want to walk through, just some examples of organizations in different industries and what they've done to have successful metadata strategies. And, I suggest to you that if you have successful metadata strategies in your organization, you should submit papers to DATAVERSITY to speak at one of their events or something like that. If you have had a successful metadata strategy, I encourage you to kind of get out and talk to people about it, share what you're doing. And that's, again, the idea of this whole webinar series has been to talk about real world examples of these things. Let me run through a few of these quickly with you. So I've, over the course of my lengthy career since I left the corporate world, I've done a lot of work for global financial institutions. And a lot of times they say that they have the same problems. They have the inconsistent definitions, conflicting reports. They're doing compliance in a manual way. They've had audits. They've had a lot of reports from outside parties that say we have gaps. We have gaps in the way we're providing lineage. We have gaps in our quality control. We have gaps in who's taking responsibility or ownership or stewardship of the data within the organization. So here's just an example of an organization that took their metadata and linked their definitions and their lineage to things, to the regulatory controls. And they were able to demonstrate that to auditors that came in and said, this metadata that we're collecting to improve people's trust in the use of the data, it became very beneficial to us. We can use it to automate some of these controls, just like I talked about in the webinar today. They certified their metadata, meaning that they had a specific process that it went through to highlight where those gaps existed. And one of the last things I talked about today was, let's not point fingers at people. Let's just highlight where the metadata is missing. And so they were able to use their metadata to expose what metadata was missing, where stewards were not identified, and those types of things. So global financial institutions, which were some of the earliest organizations that adopted metadata and data governance practices, they're still struggling with a lot of the same issues today, those that I defined in the first paragraph. And they recognize that they need to drive their governance in their organizations using the metadata that they've put a substantial effort into, a substantial investment into acquiring tools that would help them to do that. My background and my upbringing was in healthcare systems. That's not what this example is about. This example here, and like I said, back in the healthcare system or in the Blue Cross Blue Shield plan that I worked for many years ago, they kind of made fun of the idea that this guy all he talks about is metadata and that we need metadata in order to trust the data better. Well, this is another example from a healthcare network where I was working directly for the chief medical officer, who told me that he had dozens of versions of metrics and that things weren't searchable. And they realized that they needed to start to focus on, they needed to take a more intentional route to defining what metadata was important, to producing that metadata, to making that metadata accessible to people so that it could be used. Again, another example of an industry where it's their whole life is data. If they don't have a metadata strategy, if they're not implementing metadata successfully, it's going to be very difficult for them to govern their data environment. So again, the healthcare institution that's improving trust in their clinical reporting through the metadata that they're collecting and that they're providing to people throughout the organization. I've spoken in many of my webinars about a retail client that I had recently that if you're on the East Coast, you're very familiar with them. They're a convenience store chain that decided they needed to jump into AI, but they were having problems verifying what data was going into their AI models, where it came from. They were having an impossible time determining whether or not they were being biased, or the numbers that they were reporting were being biased. So they used metadata to track every data set that fed their models. They used lineage. They shifted from guessing and patching to actually knowing where the data came from, and to really a more controlled and explainable way of providing their AI models for their organization. And the last example I want to share before I turn back to Shannon for Q&A is a government example. And if you're connected to me on LinkedIn, and I hope you will be connected with me on LinkedIn, I write a lot about different subjects in data governance. And one of those subjects is I refer to as stealth governance. If you're familiar with the concept of being stealth, flying under the radar, not taking not being needing to be rewarded for every victory. This government agency, they actually were able to implement stealth governance through their metadata, meaning that they didn't have to highlight the importance of metadata or of data governance over and over again. They just provided the detailed metadata to their people that were using the data so that they had the proper trust level and confidence level in that data. So again, these are examples from 4 different industries, widely different industries, and they all understand that if they are going to be successful with their governance, that metadata is going to be an important part of that. So I'm going to summarize real quick and then turn it back to Shannon. The things I spoke about today, I provided some definitions up front, but I jumped right into those 5 advanced techniques for metadata management that are specifically there to help you to provide a metadata-driven governance program for your organization. And then those themes kind of resonated through the rest of the webinar. I talked about leveraging metadata to enhance data governance. We talked about improving quality and accessibility, some of the things that are most important to organizations, ensuring compliance, which is a no-brainer when it comes to implementing effective governance strategies. And then I shared with you a couple or 4 examples of organizations that have used metadata in effective ways to really use it to basically drive their data governance program. And with that, the last thing that I would request before turning it over to Shannon is please connect to me on LinkedIn. Just because the webinar series is ending at the end of the year, I intend to still be active in producing articles and things like that. So please connect with me there. And with that, Shannon, do we have any questions today?
Thank you so much for another great presentation. And we do have some questions coming in. If you have questions for Bob, feel free to put them in the Q&A panel of your screen there. And to answer the most commonly asked questions, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Monday for all registrants with links to the slides and links to the recording. So diving in here, Bob, do you know of any successful gamification programs that reward employees for good data governance practices?
Gamification programs. Well, that is a great subject. Um, Do I know of any games? So I guess if people aren't familiar with the term gamification, how do we make it fun? How do we make it interesting? How do we make it such that it's like a game to get people involved? I have seen in organizations, I don't know if it's always been successful, that they had a metadata cup that they provided to different parts of the organization if their the higher the level of completion of their metadata made them eligible to win the metadata cup within the organization. It's kind of a silly idea, but again, it was a way that a specific part of the organization that provided detailed non-cheeseburger type definitions to their data, that provided the lineage, that they were rewarded, that they were recognized. And what was interesting is that I think that twice a year or something, they had a get together where just to kind of move forward that whole idea of the metadata cup was to just to highlight and to recognize those winners each month over the course of the year. So that's just one way. Again, just making it interesting to people, rewarding them for good behavior, I guess is the best way to look at it. But that's just one example of where gamification has worked.
That sounds great. Um, so data owners are responsible uh, for storing metadata. Who is responsible for ensuring that this metadata is accessible to and easy for downstream users to understand?
Well, first of all, I got to talk about the first part of that question is that the owners, the data owners are not necessarily the people they may be accountable for making certain that the metadata is collected and that the metadata is accessible. But they're not the ones who necessarily provide all the definitions or are personally involved in making the metadata available. So I think that the downstream strategies is if you can make the metadata accessible to people where they are working and they don't have to jump out of a tool or into another tool to get to the metadata. I found that to be very successful in working with a bank where we could, with a financial institution here in Pittsburgh, where we could make the metadata available to people where they were doing the work. We actually made it possible for them to update the metadata. So it wasn't necessarily just the data owners that had that responsibility. It basically, the metadata became everybody's business.
So, moving on here, in a highly matrixed and global organization, can there be multiple catalogs, for example, by a region, country, or even a specific domain?
For sure, there can be. you can have a separate catalog for each system too. Um, the issue is that through acquisitions and mergers and companies coming together, they have operations in different parts of the world, and they might have catalogs, they might have metadata repositories or metadata stores in those organizations. So, I mean, it would be great, I guess, ideally in a utopian world to bring all the metadata together globally into one place. I don't know of too many organizations that have done that very successfully. Um, just having the metadata even out in a distributed fashion for different regions of the world or for different systems may be something to consider. Again, if you're going to build a data warehouse for your metadata, it's going to take a lot of effort. Just make certain that the benefit that will come from having all your metadata about all of your resources globally is going to be worth the time and efforts it's going to take to manage that metadata.
Perfect. Thank you. And so many great questions coming in. We've got 10 minutes left. We got time for plenty more. Um, Bob, sadly, compliance staff are all about pointing fingers and being punitive. So people are reluctant to be transparent. How do we eliminate the fear or failure of fear or fear of being looked at negatively or being punished for admitting gaps and improving data and data governance?
Well, that was one thing I talked about in the webinar today is if you are being successful in how you are collecting your metadata and you are able to make that metadata accessible to people, that in itself is going to highlight gaps in where metadata is missing. So you don't need to go out and say Joe and Mary over there, they didn't do their job. They didn't provide the definitions for the data elements in this specific table or this specific system. Instead of doing that, there's a softer way of doing that, and that is highlight what metadata is available and recognize what metadata is not available, and then make a intentional effort to work with those people to collect that metadata. It's not a positive negative thing. It's this organization needs this metadata to trust its data, to have confidence in its data, and this metadata is missing. We're not going to blame anybody individually. We're going to just highlight that it's missing. Hey, if at that point some executive looks at it and says, well, why do we have definitions for all these things and not for this other thing? Then maybe it can come into the conversation. But again, the idea to stay away from being punitive and just highlight what you have is a way of being able to highlight where there are gaps that need to be filled.
Thank you. So, Bob, how do you ensure and determine that the data to be employed and referenced are clean, not poisoned in the context of cybersecurity?
Ask the question again. I'm sorry.
Sure, yeah. So, how do you ensure or determine that the data to be employed or referenced are clean and not poisoned in the context of cybersecurity?
I'm not sure I understand the poisoned in the sense of cybersecurity aspect of it, but I guess first of all, it's very difficult to know if your data is correct or incorrect if you do not have a definition of what correct looks like. So having standards for data where you can compare the actual data to the standards is really important. We need to start by defining what good data looks like so then we can focus on leveraging that, but then also highlighting where we need to focus. I think I kind of drove off course on the question, but I don't know. Is there more to the question?
But Alex, if you have additional insights you want to expand on, certainly we've got time to type that in. And um,
No, no. I think that I'm forgetting what the question was. What was the question again? I'll provide more context.
and so, how do you ensure and determine that the data to be employed and referenced are clean and not poisoned in
Well,
context
you
of
need to have
cybersecurity?
this, that's the direction I was going with my answer is you need to have standards. So the only way you can't use a gut feel that your data is clean, that your data that are feeding your AI models is clean. There's got to be a way to be able to demonstrate that, whether it's to the auditors or to the business people within your organization. And one of the ways to do that, or maybe the best way to do that, would be through the metadata. So if you have good quality standards, you know what good data looks like. You can then be able to see where you're having quality issues. So I don't know if there's ever a way to make certain that your data is going to be 100% clean, but if you haven't defined what clean data looks like, the chances are you're never going to get there.
Yeah, and he expounded further that cyber attacks may use poisoning data to bias the results for specifically for AI.
Oh, and I think so it's not only just clean data because the data can be clean. So from the sensitivity of the data, I think that's important as well. So we need to have that. If we haven't defined what is sensitivity, what is classified, what is ethically inappropriate for the organization to use, if people don't know those rules, then I guess the word clean in your question is what we really need to focus on. What does it mean to have clean data? And again, I think it starts with defining what right looks like so we can determine what gaps there are.
Perfect. And there has been some additional questions here in the chat. So uh, how does metadata strategy tie with data and business strategy? There may be a lot of coinciding points, but how to envision it? It is a struggle to uncover and see the end up front and navigate towards it.
Well, I mean, there's a lot that's been written recently about the difference between a data strategy and a business strategy. I think if your data strategy doesn't incorporate the information about the data to build the comfort and build the confidence and build the trust, then there's something lacking in your data strategy. And that is that you're not effectively managing or governing your metadata. So I would say that metadata strategy. If you really want the executives in your organization for their eyes to start watering and rolling back in their head as they fall asleep in your meetings, talk to them about metadata. They're not going to want to talk about metadata. They want to understand what is going to give them and the people that use the data the most confidence in that data to be able to do what we are trying to do. If we don't have metadata, as I said earlier in this session, if your data governance program is not metadata driven, then you're taking it certainly won't become non-invasive at some point. It's going to become very difficult to repeat. So I think having a metadata strategy is important, but it needs to be, or at least in my opinion, it should really be part of your data strategy.
Makes sense. Um, and we've got uh 3 minutes here, so time for a few more, at least one more question here. In many organizations, metadata standards are built around conventional enterprise schemas. Have you had experience with indigenous metadata, which may follow a completely different schema, structure, or set of cultural protocols, be integrated and governed alongside other data assets without forcing it into a Western-centric framework? For example, Maori data often includes concepts like Wakapapa, family and ancestral relationships, um, Tikonga protocol based on access conditions, which don't align neatly with standard metadata models. How might modern metadata approaches support and respect these kinds of metadata structures?
I think you found somebody else to do a webinar with. They've got a lot to that question. The indigenous metadata, I completely understand where you're coming from, but to be honest with you, I haven't had a chance or an opportunity to work with that a lot. But if there's other people in the community that have done that, I suggest them leaving their information, and that would be a great conversation for you to have. I think that the indigenous metadata that you're talking about are examples of the types of metadata beyond the traditional tables and columns and rows and data elements and definitions and those types of things. So people who are implementing metadata strategies should really be kind of innovative in their way to look for different and unique types of metadata to incorporate into their metadata strategy. Again, it's going to improve the confidence and the trust people have in the data, and it will really help you to become help your data governance strategy to become metadata driven.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bob. Well, that does bring us right to the top of the hour. Thank you again for another great presentation. I hope y'all can join us for in December for Bob's final webinar in the series, like you mentioned. So crazy after 14 years.
Yeah, it is still crazy after all these years. Hey. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, like always, and thank you everybody for taking time to attend the session. And looking forward to seeing you in December.
Definitely. And just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email to all registrants for this webinar by end of day Monday with links to the slides and links to the recording. Thank you all for attending and being so engaged in everything we do. Really appreciate it as always, and hope you all have a great day. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care, everybody.